Thus far, our requests always succeeded. But of course, when interacting with servers, things can go wrong. You might not have an internet connection, or you're sending a request with incorrect data somehow because you have a bug in your program or whatever it is. Or your server fails. Maybe it's offline, or there's an error on the server, or you're not authenticated. There are dozens of things that can go wrong. And we can simulate such a thing that can go wrong by going to Firebase, and there in the database, let's go to rules. And remember that when we created that database, we enabled test mode, which essentially means that read and write access to this database is granted to everyone. You don't need to authenticate yourself. Now, we will add authentication in the authentication module later in the course. And therefore, for now, we open this up to everyone. Now, if I lock this down though, so if I say you're not allowed to read, for example, you can still write, but you're not allowed to read, and by setting this to false, there is no condition under which you would ever be allowed, not even if you are authenticated. So if I lock this down, what happens is that if I now try to fetch posts here, you see we get an error. And that, of course, happens, errors occur, but it is important how we react to that error. For now, for example, here, we stay in this loading state, and that is not a great user experience because now we as a user have no idea that there was an error and that something failed. Therefore, proper error handling matters. Now, how can we handle errors? There are different ways of doing that. Let me demonstrate the first possible way. Here, onFetchPost fails because, well, we have an error. Thus far, we only passed one function to subscribe, and that is the function that fires when new data is emitted. Now, as you learned in the observables section, you can pass more arguments to subscribe, and the second argument is a function that triggers whenever an error is thrown. And there we will get the error object as an argument, and now here we can do something to handle that error, to do something to provide a better user interface, or a better user experience, and that often starts with a better user interface. So for example, here what we could do is we could display an error message instead of loading. So down there where we display loading or the content we loaded, we could actually introduce a new property, error, and set this to null initially, so we have no error initially. If this is not null, so if we do have an error, and we'll add logic to change that soon, I want to add a div here with the classes alert and alert danger, which are bootstrap classes, where I simply have, let's say, h1 tag, and error occurred, and below that I want to output error, because error, in my case, in this application here, could just be an error message. And of course, it's up to you how you exactly manage that and what you store in there. Now, the idea is that this div, is only shown if we have an error. So if error is true-ish, which it is not if it is null. Initially it's null, and therefore it's treated as a false value, and therefore initially this will not show up. But as soon as we set this to some string, it becomes true-ish, and then this will show up. This also means that I only want to show loading if we are fetching, and we're not having an error. Because if we have an error, I never want to show loading, I want to show my alert here. Now, the remaining step is to set that error, and of course I want to do this here in my error handling function, and I will simply set this error equal to error.message, because by default error objects have a message. The question is if that message is helpful, but at least we can set this message for now. Now, important, of course, we are fetching posts not just here, but also in ng-on-init, so there we should add this second argument as well. And with that, let's have a look. Let's wait for that to reload, and here it is already. Now, of course, you can see this is the error message we're getting. Might not be too useful. You can definitely tweak that. You can show your own error message. You can dive into that in more details. And if you, for example, need more information from the error response, well, let's have a look at the error we got here. Let me save that. Now if I fetch posts, this is getting logged, and you see what I log here is indeed a full error response object. Now there you see that message we accessed, But you also see you got, for example, another error key with yet another error key that has maybe a more helpful error message. This, however, is not guaranteed to exist. This only exists because our error here is an error response, so the Firebase server sending back a customized error response. Now, the important thing to memorize about that, however, is you will get that HTTP error response object by Angular, and it will have an error key, but the detailed content of what's in there depends on the API you're talking to. Firebase gives you an object with another error key and that permission denied message. Your own API might not be sending this or might be sending different data. So it's always important to understand which API you're working with and what this API sends back in the case of a success message or in the case of an error. If you need more information about the error though, and not just that generic message, then you can dive into that error object you're getting, which is that object we're logging here, and there you see you can also get information about the headers, you can get the exact status code that was thrown, which can be very helpful in showing a more useful message, and so on. So you have all of that at your disposal, and I strongly encourage you to simply play around with that to properly handle errors in your application too. However, this is just one way of handling errors. Let me show you another way that might be more suitable in other cases. This other way of handling errors could be interesting in cases like when you send a request and don't subscribe to it in your component. It's easy for us to react to an error in the component here if we do return the observable and we subscribe in the component, because then we can pass this second argument to subscribe, which is this error handling function. But what about creating a post? There I subscribe in the service. Now obviously you could just return the observable there too and simply subscribe in the component instead, and that would not be wrong. But you can of course also implement a different pattern of handling that error. You could use a subject, and that is especially useful if you have multiple places in the application that might be interested in your error. So for example here, you could have your error property, which is a new subject, and subject needs to be imported from RxJS, and that will, let's say, eventually give us a string, that error message, but of course you can store in there whatever you want. And the idea then simply is that here, where we subscribe, where we get that error, we now use that subject. So this error we call next and we pass on error message. And now the remaining step is that we subscribe to that subject in all the places we're interested in that error message. So here in this example, we would subscribe in ng-on-init, for example, like this. And whenever we get our error message here, we could set this error equal to the error message. Now, of course, as you learned, it's a good and recommended practice to unsubscribe if you get rid of this component. So I'll add a new property error sub, which is a subscription, and therefore we need to import subscription from RxJS, like this. And now we can store our subscription in that property here in ng-on-init. And now we just need to add onDestroy here, this interface, and import that from @AngularCore as well. And add ng-onDestroy, therefore, maybe here at the end of the component. And there we now just want to unsubscribe. So this error sub unsubscribe. Now we use a subject-based strategy for forwarding the error, and that is fine too. No matter how you handle your error, what can be useful is a special operator that can assist you with handling errors. And that special operator needs to be imported from RxJS operators, and it's named catch error, and it does exactly what the name suggests. Now let's say here, when we fetch posts, where we already pipe some data, we got an error, and we want to handle that. Now we can simply add the catch error operator here. We get our error response in here. So we get exactly the same data we would get in that second argument of the subscribe method. And in here, you could now do stuff like send to analytics server or anything like that. So some generic error handling task you might want to do. Maybe not related to the UI, though of course you could use the subject and next the error message here too. But maybe you have some behind the scenes stuff you want to do when an error occurs. Log it somewhere, send it to your own server, your analytics server, anything like that. And once you're done handling that error, you should pass it on though. It definitely needs to be able to reach subscribe, just as you need to pass something here in map as well. So you also now need to create a new observable that wraps that error. And for that, you can import something from RxJS. And that something is throw error. And that is a function that will yield a new observable. And it yields a new observable by wrapping an error. So here we can now throw the error response. You could also throw a new custom error which you generated, whatever you want. Important, you need to return that observable which is created by throw error. And now with that, this of course doesn't do anything useful here, but it's just an idea that you could consider using catch error if you have some generic error handling task you also want to execute. That is error handling and what you can do, some ideas on how to get started with error handling. For the moment, I'll switch this rule back to true so that we can work with the data again, but it is worth keeping these concepts, these ideas in mind, because it can be very helpful and will definitely improve the experience users have on your webpage if you properly handle errors. Speaking of handling errors, one last thing we could do here. In our alert, of course, we could also add a button where we say OK or anything like this. And this is simply there for the user to get rid of that error message, where we then trigger on handle error. And now in that method in the app component, let's add on handle error. And there I simply set error back to null, and this will get rid of this error alert as well. Now to see that, I will indeed quickly switch back to false here again, so that we can get an error. So let's fetch post, here's the error, let's click OK. Now we get rid of that. Now we see loading again, and that of course should also not be the case. And indeed, the right thing to do would be to reset this isFetching property whenever we get an error as well. Because even if we have an error, we are definitely not fetching data again. So setting isFetching to false here in the error use case when we subscribe is the right thing to do. Because even with an error, you're not fetching data anymore. So that state definitely changed, and therefore it should be reflected in the UI too and in your data too. So now with this changed, here's the error. And if we handle this, we just see no posts available, which makes more sense than loading, I guess. So with that out of the way, however, let's now really switch this back to true. And now we have an error handling strategy that is very basic, but a good start.